Good morning, all, and Happy New Year. Yes, there's no sign on my back today for Diane. Next Sunday is Birthday Sunday. Do we have any January birthdays here today with us? I can't see anything over the lights. Prayer group will be on the 14th at 11 a.m., and lunch will follow it at BJ's at 11:45. The canned goods we were collecting will still be collecting through the 14th. And remember, Alabaster, your change that goes 100% to the missions, that will be collected in March. And remember to always view us on YouTube, our Facebook page, and right on our website itself. And now, Pastor Cassie.
Good morning. Happy New Year. I only have one announcement, and for the life of me, I can't recall the date, but in February, on a Saturday in February, and I'll get the date for you, and we'll make sure we post it and all of those things. We haven't forgotten about the podcast. I want people to know that. We haven't forgotten about the podcast. So we're going to be having a breakfast meeting, recording. We are getting it going, and so that's very exciting. And so if that's something that you were interested in and you were working on with us, come see me after service and we will talk about that so that you can make sure that you're here and that you can participate in that. Maybe you didn't initially think that you were going to participate in that. Maybe you didn't participate in the book study, or maybe you don't even know what it's about, but you think maybe that might be something you're interested in. You want to learn more about it. Come see me. I will explain it to you. And even if you weren't involved in the very beginning, come out, listen to what we're doing. Maybe you would like to be involved now. We hope that this is something that grows and evolves and that reaches others, but also we're able to help people through what we've been learning together. So if you are interested in the podcast, we are still doing it. It is still happening. And we will be recording our first episode in February. So come talk to me and I'll get you the details of that. We are so excited that you are here and beginning your new year among the community of believers. What a great way to start the year. All of us here together, worshiping together, reading scripture together, and just being the body of Christ among one another. We are excited that you're here for that. So if you would stand with me, our call to worship this morning will come from Psalm 8. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Yet you have made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You've given them dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the seas. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You can be seated. Well, you may be wondering where we're going to be this morning since we've just finished our Advent series, and last week we spent some time in Luke 2 and talked about the Christmas story. We are going to be back in Acts. We were taking a journey through Acts over the past several months, and we've made it to chapter 10, and that's where we're going to be today, and we're just going to do verses 1 to 33 in chapter 10. And why are we going through Acts? Let's refresh. Why are we doing that? Well, we're going through Acts because we are trying to learn and to understand what it means to reclaim the practices of the early church and the new beginnings that happened there and the way that they ministered to people and how the church grew and grew and grew. And we had many discussions about that as we were going through a book study, and we thought, you know what? How did that happen and how did that work? And why was it so successful? And how can we reclaim those practices so, again, we can take the story of Jesus to all the nations so that people would come to know God and they would come to know his son? And so that's why we're going through Acts. So we're in chapter 10 this morning, and verses 1 to 33. I know it's a lot, but I am going to read that to you because I think it's so important that we read each verse before we dive in. In Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort, as it was called. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. One afternoon at about 3 o'clock, he had a vision in which he clearly saw an angel of God coming in and saying to him, "Cornelius." He stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" He answered, "Your prayers and alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with Simon, a tanner whose house is by the seaside." When the angel who spoke to him had left, he called 2 of his slaves and a devout soldier from the ranks of those who served him. And after telling them everything, he sent them to Joppa. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its 4 corners. In it were all kinds of 4-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and this thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Now, while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision that he had seen, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. And they called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, "I am the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" They answered, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man, who is well spoken by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house to hear what you have to say." So Peter invited them in and gave them lodging. The next day he got up and went with them, and some of the believers from Joppa accompanied him. The following day they came to Caesarea. Cornelius was expecting them and had called together his relatives and close friends. On Peter's arrival, Cornelius met him, and falling at his feet, worshipped him. But Peter made him get up, saying, "Stand up, I am only a mortal." And as he talked with him, he went in and found that many had assembled, and he said to them, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent for, I came without objection. Now may I ask why you have sent for me?" Cornelius replied, 4 days ago at this very hour, at 3 o'clock, I was praying in my house when suddenly a man in dazzling clothes stood before me. He said, "Cornelius, your prayer has been heard and your alms have been remembered before God. Send therefore to Joppa and ask for Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying in the home of Simon, a tanner by the sea. Therefore I sent for you immediately, and you have been kind enough to come. So now all of us are here in the presence of God to listen to all that the Lord has commanded you to say." Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning, and we just thank you for your presence here in this service. God, we know that you have things to say to us this morning. We would ask that you would give us open hearts and open ears, ready and willing to hear what it is that you have to say. God, this morning I ask that the words that are spoken would be your words and not mine. We start in the beginning of chapter 10 with a man named Cornelius, and he is described as a centurion of the Italian cohort. So this tells us a couple of things. It tells us first that he's a Roman citizen, and then he holds a very high community position. He is the head of at least 100 men. So the Italian cohort that he would have been a part of was about 600 men strong, and he would have been in charge of at least 100 of those men. So given all of this information, he's a centurion, he's in charge of all of these individuals, he holds a high community status. We can also deduce that he is not a practicing Jew. So he would not have had the same customs of Peter or any of the Jewish men for that matter. So what he was doing is kind of odd. The way that he was living his life was a little bit odd for someone of his social status and of his culture. And so he's described, we're painted a picture of Cornelius. He's described in 4 ways. First, he's described as being devout. He's being devout. He's then described as being fearful of the Lord. He respected the Lord. He understood and feared his authority. And not only did he fear it, but his entire household. Number 3, he gave alms generously. He gave to the poor. He would not have been required to do this. In fact, most people of his social status in that day or of his position, that just wouldn't have been something that they would have done. And then number 4, it says that he was committed to prayer. He was constantly praying to God. Again, this would have been something that was very countercultural for him and his current community and social status, his culture. It wouldn't have been something that would be typical for a centurion to do. However, Cornelius, he was doing these things, and he's described in this way. And it says in verse 3 that he was praying at 3 p.m. Well, this is even more curious because 3 p.m. would have been one of the Jewish times for prayer. So he was recognizing these customs that were not his own. And not only were they not his own, these are completely 2 separate people groups, 2 people that they just wouldn't have interacted. It just wouldn't have been done. But nevertheless, he'd adopted these practices. He's devout in his relationship with the Lord. He's in constant prayer. And not only that, but he's praying during the Jewish times of prayer. And so as he's praying, we read and we heard that he was given a vision, and he was startled by it, but he recognized that this was the voice of the Lord. He knew that this was the voice of the Lord, and so he paid attention. And so the angel is telling him, hey, the Lord has recognized what you are doing. He has recognized the way that you are living your life, and these prayers that you have been praying and these alms that you've been giving to the poor, they have been recognized by God, and he finds these offerings pleasing to him. He recognizes it as a memorial to himself. And as I read that, and I was reading even a commentary on it, it's easy to think that the focus is on what's happening with Cornelius. But in fact, the focus is really on God. The focus here is on God and how Cornelius is living this life of worship, and he's lifting up the name of the Lord, and God is recognizing that, hey, I have found your worship pleasing to myself. I have recognized it, and I accept it. And so then the angel gives Cornelius some really specific instructions. He says, I want you to go find this man Peter who's living with a tanner by the sea, and I need you to bring him back here. And so Cornelius was obedient. He listened to these words, and then immediately he called, one of his soldiers and 2 of his devoted slaves, and he shares with them the vision that he had seen and what he had heard. And he says, I need you to go to Joppa. I need you to go and get this man and bring him here because I received a vision from the Lord. Well, that's even more curious because those people, they knew Cornelius and they were members of his household. They may have thought, this is kind of strange. This isn't something that we typically do as Roman citizens. But nevertheless, they were obedient. They respected him as their leader, and they were obedient, and they left and they went on their way to Joppa. Well, at the same time, Peter is in Joppa, so they're traveling there. This happens the first day. So the second day in their travel, Peter, it's about noon, and that's lunchtime, so he's hungry, and he goes up to the rooftop to pray. And as he's praying, Peter also receives a vision, although it's really different from the vision that Cornelius received. Peter, he sees a sheet being lowered down in front of him, and on that sheet are birds and reptiles and hooved animals, all of the things he can't have. And so here he is hungry, and he's going up there to pray, and these animals are down in front of him, and he recognizes all of these things are unclean. I cannot be a part of this. My entire life, I've never had anything that I wasn't supposed to have. I have followed the Levitical law. I can't do it. I just can't cross that boundary. And so again, it's lowered down before him, and he says it again, and the Spirit speaks to him and says, hey, you can't call anything unclean that I have made. And Peter, 3 times, isn't that familiar? 3 times he says, no, I can't take part in this. And 3 times the Spirit says, do not call anything that I have made unclean or profane. And then all of a sudden, it's just taken up from his eyes. And Peter, he's confused. He's thinking, what in the world does this mean? What have I just witnessed? And while he's doing that, he's completely just like sucked into that, thinking about it. And at the same time, these men that were traveling to tell him about the vision of Cornelius, they're calling out from the street, hey, is this the home of Peter? Is this where Peter is? And he can't hear them because he's just thinking about the experience that he just had. So the Spirit, again, he interrupts him and says, hey, these people are here to see you. And in that moment, Peter, he goes and he tells them, hey, come on into the home. And that's unusual too. So the men, they tell Peter all that they had heard. They tell him about Cornelius. They tell him about the vision, and they said, hey, will you come back with us? And Peter says, yes, I will come back with you. But first, I want you to stay here with me in the home, and then we'll get up in the morning and we'll go on our way. And so that's what they did. They stayed with him. And then in the morning, they got up and they were going on their way to meet with Cornelius to see what it is that he wanted. And so when they get there, Cornelius, he's waiting. He knew he would come, and he's waiting for him with all of his friends and all of his relatives. And he immediately bows down to worship Peter. And Peter is quick to let him know, I am not the one that you should be worshiping. And so as we read this story, we might not think a whole lot about these interactions. We might think, well, Cornelius saw the vision. He sent his people. They were obedient. Peter's a follower of Jesus, so he was obedient. And we don't think about all of the things that are happening here. When in fact, everything about this story, everything about these encounters are countercultural. Everything that's happening here, every little piece of information is countercultural to what would have been happening in that day. So if we start with Cornelius, he's a Gentile man, a Roman leader of many men. And so it would not have been typical for him to worship and fear the God that the Jews would worship. It just wouldn't have been typical. It would also not have been really typical of him to pray in this way or to give alms to the poor. It just was not the norm. The second thing that's countercultural, Peter, he's a Jewish man who would have taken very seriously the Levitical law and what it meant to remain clean. He's staying in the home of a tanner. Well, I don't know if you know a whole lot about that occupation, but it was pretty gross. It was pretty dirty. It was kind of a disgusting thing. A tanner would have been a person who would have been dealing with animal hide. And so that was kind of a really dirty occupation. And not only that, but individuals who were tanners couldn't live inside the city, inside the community, because it was really smelly. So they lived outside of the community on the outskirts, and people really didn't want to spend a lot of time with them because it was pretty smelly and pretty gross. And so the fact that Peter is staying in this man's home, the ultimate of unclean environments, that's pretty countercultural of that day, that Peter would even be associating with this person or staying in his home. Well, then what's the next thing that's countercultural that happens here? Well, Peter, he's up on the roof and praying. That's not abnormal. That's pretty normal. And Peter's hungry, and people are preparing food. That's pretty normal. But the Lord sends down all of these animals that would have been considered unclean. And that was not on accident, right? That was purposeful because God was teaching Peter something in this moment. Here he is in the midst of the most unclean of environments, faced with what he would have been taught to be the most unclean of foods that he should never ever let pass his lips. And the Lord is saying, hey, you're hungry. I've provided this for you. Go ahead and eat it. And Peter thinks, no, I can't. I can't do that. I find that a little bit curious because Peter was willingly staying in the home of the tanner. He's willingly staying among an unclean person, but he himself was really afraid of being defiled, of becoming unclean. He was okay with other people being unclean and loving on them, but the fact that that might encounter his world and it might enter into him in a different way, he was holding so tightly to his traditions, he just couldn't look past it. And he was kind of making himself separate from others, saying, well, Jesus is for you in this way, but it's different for me. I have to be held to a different standard. I can't be holding myself to the same standard that I'm holding you to. because I just have to be a little bit of a step above. And that was wrong. That way of thinking is wrong. But God, he was encountering Peter right where he was in order to teach him a lesson. So what's another thing that was completely countercultural? Well, all of these Gentile individuals who came to meet with him, he invited them to stay in the home with him. Well, this would have been unlawful for them to stay in the same place. So again, this is a countercultural thing that Peter's doing. And all the while, God's preparing him for it. He's preparing him for this journey that he's about to take him on by allowing him to learn these different things along the way. And so then they get up the next morning and they begin to travel to a Gentile home. Again, countercultural. Again, really unacceptable for these two people groups to be interacting with one another. You know, Peter, he did not understand the vision that he had had initially, but God was preparing him for an encounter he was about to have. God was teaching him in really real ways what it meant to make disciples who make disciples. He was teaching him what it really means to live among others. But at the time, as true for most of us when God is teaching us lessons, we might not be fully aware of what's happening and how it ties together. And I think that's probably true for Peter. He probably wasn't putting all these pieces together. He was probably thinking, well, I had this experience. I don't quite understand that yet, but I've got to deal with this because God has sent this person to me. And then I have to go over here because that's what God has asked me to do. And I think that Peter was thinking of those maybe still at the time as three separate events, when in fact, God was bringing them all together, tying them together so that he would fully prepare Peter to fulfill the call that he had placed on his life. You know, when he started out on this journey, the disciples and Peter, I don't think that they ever fully could have grasped what Jesus meant when he said, I want you to make disciples of all the nations. And they didn't understand what that would look like because they'd never done it before. They had never experienced it before. They had never interacted with people in that way. And so they couldn't fully understand what that might look like. And that's true for us today. As we enter into a relationship with Jesus, we can't even begin to imagine the lessons that we're going to learn. We can't even begin to imagine what that might look like, the people that we're going to encounter, the ways that we ourselves are going to be changed. Not just others and how they'll be changed by our witness, but how we ourselves are going to be changed in our growth with the Lord. And, what happens to a lot of us, especially those of us who've been in the church for a really long time, is that we begin to cling to some of our traditions. And they're good things. The Levitical law, although really confusing and really long, was a really good thing because what it did was it shaped a nation, it shaped a group of people to point the way to the Messiah. And so those were good things that were needed in those days. But after the Messiah came, things were different. Things had to change. But they had really practiced those things for a long time. And so they had become such an integral part of their life, something that had become so important to their faith journey and their understanding of God and their understanding of the coming of Jesus. And so they just couldn't understand how getting rid of those things could be helpful. They were scared. They were nervous. It's the way they had always done things. And that is so true for us in the church today. There are ways that we have always done things. And sometimes God says, hey, we don't need to do that anymore. That's not important in this time, but it's scary for us, and we cling to it because we don't know any other way. And it takes a lot of faith and a lot of trust in the Lord and a lot of community with others to be able to step into those things. It doesn't mean that it's not scary. It doesn't mean that it's wrong when we question. Jesus allowed Peter to question things. And he just kept giving him responses. Hey, I understand your fears, but don't call anything that I've made unclean. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that's going to hurt you. I'm only going to ask you to do things that are only for your good and for the good of others. And so if you just trust me, if you would just listen to what I have to say, and if you would just go with these men and do these things, I'm going to show you why. I'm going to show you why it is I'm doing this. And the same is true for us. Sometimes God asks us to do things, and we're so scared to do them because it's just not the way that we've done them in the past. And so we cling on to them, and God is saying to us, hey, it's okay. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that's going to harm you. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that's outside of my will or outside of my word or outside of the call that I've had on your life. I'm going to prepare you. I'm going to equip you. But you have to let go and you have to trust a little. And so that's what he's teaching Peter in these moments, and that's what we can learn from these verses. We can't cling so tightly to our traditions that we miss the beautiful transformation that God has in store for us, and that he has in store for others through us. In verse 28, Peter says, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate or visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean." You know, in the moment that Peter was in the trance, he was focused on the food. He was focused on the literal thing that was right in front of him, and he just couldn't look at it any other way because, first of all, he didn't really understand why this was happening. Like, why are you showing me this? Why are you asking me this? And he kept thinking, this is certainly about the food. Well, the truth is, oftentimes when God speaks to us, it's never about what we think it is, right? It's never about exactly what we can see, but rather it's what he sees and what he knows he's preparing us for and what's to come. And so he just keeps thinking, hey, these are things I can't eat. These are things I've always thought to be unclean. You know, they're not to be consumed, and he didn't want to defile himself. And because of that, because of his very literal thinking, and oftentimes we can have some pretty literal thinking, he was missing the point. You know, being defiled, the thought of being defiled, was keeping him from worshiping and communicating with God in the way that he was trying to show him. He was really self-focused. But the whole point here was for Peter to shift the focus from himself and his traditions and to focus on the will of God and his inclusivity of the people in the kingdom. The story of Jesus is for all people. That's what God is trying to teach Peter here. Hey, I came and I am the Messiah, and I came for you, and I came for the disciples, and I came for the Jewish nation to fulfill my promise. But I did that so that I could also come for all people, and I'm doing that through you. And so because of that, it's going to stretch you a little bit. It's going to make you a little bit uncomfortable. It's going to make you have to do things maybe that you've never done before. And if you would just shift the focus on how this might affect you, and shift your eyes and fix them back on me, I promise you it's going to be good. I promise you that this journey is going to be good, and you are going to see what it is that I'm trying to teach you. You know, when we first read this story, it's really, really easy for us to think, well, this is a story about Cornelius and his conversion and the conversion of his family, and this is a story about Peter and him learning new lessons about the Lord. And that's true. Both of those things are true. This is a story about Cornelius and his conversion and the conversion of his family. And this is a story about Peter learning new things. But what's most important is while both of those things are true, this is a story about God and how he connects us to his story and how he continues to connect us to his son. He is the central character here. You know, Cornelius isn't the central character. This really isn't about Cornelius. Peter isn't the central character. It's really not about Peter. It's about God. It's about God and his mission for his people and how he wants to connect his people and to join him in his story and his redemptive work for the world. So Cornelius, he's being obedient to God, but he doesn't even really know that. He knows who God is. He knows that he's being obedient to what it is he thinks he wants for his life. You know, he's described as devout, God-fearing, dedicated to prayer, dedicated to giving alms to the poor. And he knew that there was action required on his part by believing in the Lord. That's evident. You know, he's praying, he believes that God is real, but he's also giving alms to the poor. So he knows that there's action required on his part. But the thing is, what he's missing is Jesus. He knows who God is. He knows that he is good. He knows that he is to be feared and to be followed and to pray to and to be worshiped, but he doesn't know Jesus. He doesn't know the next part of the story. He doesn't know about the freedom that comes in following him. He doesn't know about the way that he can encounter conversations with the Lord because of our relationship with Jesus. And you know, that is still true today. You know, there are many people, maybe even people in the church, certainly people out in the world, that they know who God is. They have a basic understanding of him. They believe that he's real, that he is who he says he is, and that he is to be feared. And they even say prayers, and they worship him, and they do good things. They do good things for others. They do good things in their community, but they don't know who Jesus is. They haven't had an encounter with Jesus. And, they're good people doing good things, but they're missing something. And what's so exciting here is that we as believers, Peter as a follower of Jesus, we have the ability to tell them about this missing piece, to introduce them to Jesus, who connects all things, who converses with us, who is our greatest example, who shows us how it is that we be living in the world. Peter, he walked with Jesus. He ate with Jesus. He lived with Jesus. He knew who he was. He saw how Jesus interacted with the marginalized. He saw how Jesus was among the unclean. But Peter, he still struggled because he was holding on to his traditions. He knew God. He knew Jesus. He knew the beauty of sharing the story of Jesus. He knew how that would transform the lives of people. But God gave Peter a vision in order to teach him something really important. He gave him this vision to teach him that while you know that I did these things on earth, that I lived in this way, and you know this to be a great way to live, you believe that I'm the Messiah, I've called you in this world to be like Jesus. I've called you to be like me. So it's not enough to believe that I am who I say that I am. And it's not enough to think that everything that I had done was so important and so good and so needed, but you need to emulate those things. You need to be out in the world doing those things. You need to be among the marginalized. You need to be among the unclean. And sometimes your hands might get a little dirty in the process. Sometimes the unclean might enter into your life in a way that you're not exactly comfortable with. But I'm here to promise you that I have done it. Jesus promises us, hey, I did it. I did these things, and you can too, because I am your example. And I'm going to be here with you all along the way, because I'm not going to ask you to do anything that isn't for your good. Before service, I was texting with someone that I used to attend church with, and we're still very close, and we were talking about a situation, and I said, remember that verse? We've created a life verse over these two families, and it's Romans 8:28. God brings all things together for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And so I think that in this moment, Jesus is reminding Peter, hey, I'm bringing all things together for your good, all for your good. Because you are called according to my purpose. And what is my purpose? My purpose is that in this world, you are like Jesus. That in this world, you will be a disciple who makes disciples. And oftentimes, that's going to mean stepping out of your comfort zone, doing things you've never done before, maybe setting aside some traditions in order to walk more closely with me, in order to keep your eyes fixed on me so that you can help the Corneliuses of the world. The people who know who God is, they believe him to be true. They believe him to be real. They even say their prayers to him. Your job is to introduce them to Jesus, to introduce them to this man who makes all things new, who offers freedom, who offers redemption. And that's what your calling is, Peter. And the truth is, that's what our calling is as well. We have the missing link. Right? We have the missing link, the thing that people are missing in their lives. And we have the story of Jesus, and we are called to share it. We are not just called to share the story of Jesus during Bible study or from the pulpit or from, traditional faith conversations or in the church setting, but we are called to enter into homes of Simon the Tanner, maybe places that are really gross, places that no one wants to go, that are stuck on the outskirts, that people don't want to associate with. We're called to those places. And we're called to the places of the people that maybe are outside of our cultural norm. We're called to the homes of people that maybe we wouldn't have associated with before. Not only are we called to go to those places, but we're called to invite them into ours as well. And so this is what this story means for us. This is what Peter learns here, is that the story of Jesus is for all people. But it's not just like, oh, the story of Jesus is for you and it can help you. But the story of Jesus still continues to transform me. And there's still things as believers, even people who've been believers for a long time, that we need to learn and that we need to pay attention to and that we need to absorb, because he's still telling us things as well. There's still things for us to learn. Even while we're out teaching others, there are things for us to learn. And so we are called to share with others in the midst of our everyday life, on the street corners, in our homes, at basketball games or coffee shops, wherever you are called to share the story of Jesus. Now, you might be thinking, well, I'm not really comfortable with standing out here and saying, hey, look at me, I'm going to tell you the story of Jesus. That's really not what this means, That's not what this means. That's not what happens here in this story. Peter, he's obedient. He goes to the place where the Lord asks him to go, and he shows up there. He doesn't know what he's going to say. He doesn't know what God wants him to say. He doesn't know the questions that are going to be asked of him. He just goes in obedience. And the truth is that that's all that God asks of you. That you would keep your eyes fixed on Jesus. That you would go where he asks you to go in obedience. He'll give you the words when you get there. He will give you the words. And maybe they won't be, maybe it won't be that you're quoting a scripture. And maybe it won't be that you're telling someone how to accept Jesus in their heart, but it might just be that you're there to love on somebody in the midst of the mess. And while you do that, and as you build those relationships, and you go to those places, and you live counterculturally, people will be changed by the way that you live your life. It doesn't always have to be out loud. It doesn't always have to be some grand sermon or some, practiced speech. God will give you the words. If he asks you to do something and he prepares you for it, he'll give you the words in the moment that you need them. All he asks is for our obedience, to be the missing piece. We are the people with the missing piece so that so many people can find what it is that they're searching for. So in this new year, as we enter this new year, the very first day of it, as we're here as the community of believers, let's make that our challenge for the new year. Let's make that something that we adopt, that we say, hey, Lord, I'm going to be obedient to you, whatever that means, whatever that looks like. I'm going to go the places that you ask me to go. I'm going to do the things that you ask me to do, and I'm going to say the words that you give me, no matter what that means, because I know that you are a God who will bring all things together for my good, so long as I am called according to your purpose. And let's remember that. So this morning, we're going to have some music play, and as that plays, come to the communion table and be thankful for the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. Be thankful for that. And then ask God, hey, God, show me, how can I be obedient to you this year? How can I be obedient about where I go and what I do and what I say?